My name is Rory Kennedy. I'm a documentary filmmaker, and I live in New York City. On 9/11, I was living 20 blocks north of the World Trade Center. In the days that followed, I was constantly reminded of what it meant to be under attack, to be vulnerable. Soon the case would be made for fighting the war on terror abroad. But was enough being done to protect ourselves from the terrorist threat at home? If 9/11 could happen, and it did, then a whole new realm of possibilities was opening up. And it was now time to imagine the unimaginable. On the day the World Trade Center was attacked, American Airlines Flight 11 navigated down the Hudson Valley, finding its way towards its target, past farmlands, past fields, past Indian Point, a nuclear power plant just 35 miles north of Midtown Manhattan. What if that plane had banked left instead of continuing on its path? What if Indian Point were struck by that plane?
Hello.
Hi, this is Rory Kennedy.
This is Art Weesey at Entergy.
I contacted Entergy, the company that owns Indian Point, about participating in this film.
Ms. Kennedy, you are the sister of Robert Kennedy Jr., who is, leading the fight to close the plant. So obviously I have some concern about the objectivity of a documentary.
After several more attempts to contact Entergy, I realized they weren't going to talk to me on camera. But I knew that my brother Bobby would.
Indian Point Power Plant is arguably the most attractive terrorist target in the world.
Bobby is the lead attorney for the environmental group Riverkeeper. He lives 12 miles from the plant and is very passionate about this issue.
There's no other way that you could easily destroy the habitability of New York City, destroy the world financial network, potentially collapse the international banking system as trillions of dollars of real estate are rendered valueless, destroy the cultural and economic center of the United States.
It was easy to understand why Entergy wouldn't talk to me. In part because of critics of nuclear power, the industry has suffered from a bad reputation through the years. But that wasn't always the case.
The peaceful atom is here now.
Historically, nuclear power carried with it a lot of promise and was promoted as a new type of energy source that was cheap, reliable, and environmentally friendly.
During the next 10 years, atomic plants will be springing up throughout the nation. This is a model of a station which will go into operation outside of New York City sometime in 1960.
This is the upper south field of Indian Point, just above the swimming pool area.
Francis Stein is the local historian near Indian Point.
And they had playgrounds for kids, tremendous picnic areas, a place where you can go boating on the lake. And they had speedboat rides that came in right beside the dock. We hated to see the park go, but, they had to destroy all that area. And, of course, just off of that landing, they put in 3 power plants.
Indian Point is one of the first nuclear power stations serving a large metropolitan area.
Con Ed got their permit to build Indian Point 1, the first of 3 reactors at the site, in 1954, on the east side of the Hudson River.
Less than 35 miles from the heart of New York City.
In Indian Point's nuclear reactors, fission takes place when uranium atoms are split. This produces heat, creating steam to drive a turbine to generate electricity. The reactors are housed inside heavily reinforced containment domes. It may sound simple, but running the plants has not been so easy. Throughout its operating history, Indian Point has been plagued by accidents and safety violations. It all culminated in a steam generator tube rupture in the year 2000.
A nuclear accident at Indian Point 2 puts Westchester on alert.
A radiation leak in Buchanan, a very small amount escaped into the atmosphere.
Soon afterward, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the government agency that monitors plant safety, gave Indian Point 2 a red rating. This led to the plant being shut down for nearly a year.
It's the worst safety rating possible for the Buchanan power plant and the first plant in the nation to get such a severe citation.
The rating eventually went up, and Indian Point appeared to be a sound investment. If the plants were to run at 100% capacity, it's estimated they could bring in nearly $2 million a day. Entergy, an energy company based in New Orleans, purchased Indian Point's power plants, completing the deals on September 9th, 2001. 2 days later, the terrorists struck.
Our discoveries in Afghanistan confirmed our worst fears. We have found diagrams of American nuclear power plants, surveillance maps of American cities, and thorough descriptions of landmarks in America and throughout the world.
The president was telling us we had good reason to be concerned. Here was something that both the Republicans and the Democrats could agree on.
New York City is a huge target because it's the biggest financial center in this country, and they clearly want to harm us in every way possible, economically, in terms of killing as many people as possible. Would be a good target. If I wanted to kill as many people as I could, that'd be a good place to start. They were the Super Bowl. Super Bowl is a good target. And Indian Point in the Super Bowl, I'd have to put in my top 5.
A major terrorist event in the United States was no longer just a possibility. I wanted to know, how vulnerable is Indian Point to an air attack? I spoke with Nuclear Regulatory Commissioner Edward McGaffigan, a Clinton appointee.
Do you think that a major airline, like 767 type plane, could penetrate Indian Point?
I don't say that the plant is impregnable. Whether in what way it could cause damage to the plant, I'm not going to go into it because I'm not going to aid Al-Qaeda, but it is a very, very, very difficult thing for even a 767 to cause damage to that facility, and I'll just leave it at that.
On September 11th, 2001, the hijackers actually used the Hudson River as a navigational point to find New York City. If they had banked left and hit Indian Point rather than proceeded down to the World Trade Center, this area, 50-mile radius, 20 million people, this area could be uninhabitable today. In the weeks immediately after 9/11, the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration, declared a no-fly zone over Indian Point Power Plant, but then they lifted it. And today there is no no-fly zone over the plant. Anybody can fly over that plant. There are no-fly zones over Disney World and over Disneyland. There was no-fly zones over the Valdez Oil Terminal. There's a no-fly zone over the Super Bowl. So we should have a no-fly zone over Indian Point Power Plant, but at this point, we don't have one. Indian Point was not designed to withstand the kind of terrorist attack that we saw on 9/11, where you have determined teams willing to kill themselves and willing to use, for example, aircraft and highly technical planning of that event.
Indian Point Energy Center today. Safe, secure.
Today, Entergy distributes a free informational video. In it, they make a case for the plant's ability to withstand an airline attack on the containment domes.
Recently, 19 prominent nuclear experts concluded that a reactor containment building could easily withstand the force of a jetliner crash.
The nuclear industry has trotted out this old study from the Sandia laboratory that they are trying to use to make the case that these reactor domes are in fact very robust and would withstand any kind of airline crash into them. The Sandia Lab scientist who had actually conducted the original study said, this study that we did does not in any way answer the question of whether those reactor domes are vulnerable.
The actual Sandia study, shown here, does not address power plant vulnerabilities. But the Entergy video, with its simulation of a jumbo jet crashing into a containment dome, suggests that it does.
An unmanned fighter jet on rails was crashed into a test wall at 480 miles per hour. The engines penetrated only about 2 inches.
The Sandia study is not in any way analogous to the situation at a nuclear power plant. The cement walls that make up the reactor domes at Indian Point are anywhere from 3.5 feet to about 5 feet thick. The piece of cement that the Sandia Lab folks used was 12 feet thick, and it was not anchored in the ground. It was on a floating platform so that when the impact of the jet was borne onto the cement block, of course the block went back a few feet. The jet itself was an F-4 fighter jet, which is much, much smaller, so it's not analogous to a major commercial airliner. And finally, it was an empty jet. It didn't have any fuel in it. The jury is still out as to the question of whether the containment domes that surround the reactors themselves are robust enough to repel or withstand the crashing of a jumbo jet.
I hear a lot about the containment domes and whether they can keep airplanes in or out. It's a totally irrelevant question.
David Lochbaum is the nuclear safety engineer for the Union of Concerned Scientists, a nonprofit watchdog group.
No terrorist who's behind the controls of an aircraft is going to aim at the strongest part of the plant. If you put that plane into the control room of a plant, which is outside of that heavily reinforced concrete dome, that's the brain of the plant. If you destroy the brain, the body doesn't have long to live.
Although the NRC did not directly address concerns about Indian Point's control room vulnerability, it did claim that many safety systems at nuclear power plants start automatically, and that the plants have alternate control facilities in place.
Probably the worst thing and the most catastrophic release of radioactivity that you would get from Indian Point, and terrorists know this, is to hit the spent fuel pools. At Indian Point, there are 30 years of spent fuel, irradiated spent fuel, that are still stored in butler shacks, in unprotected, unhardened structures on the site of Indian Point.
Over 1,400 tons of spent nuclear fuel, which needs to be safely stored for at least 600 years, is kept on site in what's called spent fuel pools. Critics believe they're among the most vulnerable parts of the plant. Yet there's a real disconnect between Riverkeeper's position on the spent fuel pools and what the NRC has to say.
As I say, one of the spent fuel pools is essentially impregnable. The other spent fuel pool is surrounded on 3 sides by structures and is below grade on 3 sides. On one side, you have to go through 2 very robust walls before you would get to the spent fuel pool and potentially rupture it. That is not something that is likely to happen.
The pools themselves have parts of their structure that are above ground, so that if they were punctured, you would get a water release. And if the water drops below the spent fuel rods, they will heat up and potentially release 100% of the radiation from those irradiated spent fuel rods in a fire.
The chances of that happening are very, very small at every facility and are ridiculously small at Indian Point.
Regardless, it was not at all reassuring when we were able to fly over the plant unimpeded.
Do you think it's surprising we've now been up here for 25 minutes that there have been no calls or questions about why we're up here and what we're doing?
It's not surprising to me that we're not being shooed away at this point, because other people have done this and tested the defenses of Indian Point, the air defenses of Indian Point Power Plant, and there are none. If you were in a small, like a Cessna 172 right now, we're literally 2 or 3 seconds away from Indian Point, and there's nobody out there with any kind of protection. There's no air protection at all.
A potential air attack is one of the many threats that Indian Point could face. According to some critics, the plant is also vulnerable to attacks from the ground.
We not only have to look again.
New York Senators Schumer and Clinton, both Democrats, have raised concerns about Indian Point's security.
Hey, it's Rory Kennedy calling. I know you weren't able to find any dates for us in February, but hoping that we could lock something in for March.
When I contacted their offices about this documentary, they both declined to participate. The same went for Mayor Bloomberg and Governor Pataki.
I have bad news.
Really?
Yeah, he can't do it.
Since it seemed no New York politician wanted to speak to me, I went back to my Massachusetts roots.
An Islamic terrorist.
Congressman Edward Markey has been a longtime critic of nuclear power plant security.
Well, nuclear power plants are still at the very top of the Al-Qaeda terrorist target list. So it's very important for the United States to place the maximum amount of security around nuclear power plants, since we know that Al-Qaeda wants to have the maximum possible damaging impact on our country, and nuclear power plants would make that possible.
Nuclear plants are not very good targets for terrorists.
Marvin Fertel is a senior vice president at the Nuclear Energy Institute, the industry's main lobbying group.
They're hardened targets with guys with big guns, with all kinds of detection. They're hard to hurt relative to other targets that are much softer targets. Now, that doesn't mean you don't prepare. It just means if you're a terrorist, you're going to look at where you think you can do your damage the easiest and the best. And nuclear plants are maybe on a list because they have that certain aura, but they're not the best targets.
About 7,000 trained security professionals guard our nuclear power plant sites in the United States. They are well-trained, highly motivated professionals.
We have 103 nuclear plants in our country, and all of them had very robust security even before the tragic events of 9/11. Since 9/11, we've actually dramatically increased security at our plants. We've added about another 2,000 security officers. We've spent about $500 million, and we're going to spend about another $500 million. So we believe, and I think the whole country believes right now, that our nuclear plants are really the most secure facilities in the country.
Foster Zay, a former guard at Indian Point, paints a much different picture.
Well, I mean, the plant itself is so vulnerable. I mean, because of the obviously the terrain around the plant. But, I mean, the buildings here, I can think of at least 10 or 15 different ways of getting into vital areas within those buildings that would cause serious damage to the plant and cause a radioactive release.
Foster worked at the plant for over 6 years as both a guard and security supervisor. He also helped train other members of the guard force.
There was a good 20% of the security force members, 25%, that couldn't get off the ground without assistance. If they had to move tactically from point A to point B, I don't think these security force members could have gotten there to effectively defend the plant.
That would be a problem. Going from the prone position to sitting upright, I think, is important in repelling any terrorist attack. Most of the Al-Qaeda guys that I see in the training can get up from a prone position to a sitting position. I think bin Laden actually required that.
Morale was so bad that security officers were fighting with security officers. Unions were fighting with unions. We had a security officer pull a gun on another security officer over orange juice because he was so stressed out over hours. In the front of your mind, you knew that there was very little you can do with what they were giving you. There was no budget for training. You know, it was more that we were there in body than in substance.
In drills similar to the one shown here, Foster and the other guards would train to repel attackers.
The drills were designed on strengths, not on weaknesses. The whole time that I was at Indian Point, the force-on-force drills basically were what we all call a Broadway show. We had a script. We were told what we needed to do. We were told where to enter, how to enter. We would do these drills with the least amount of adversaries as possible, with the least amount of security force members as possible. They were designed to allow the security force members to succeed. But in fact, what happened was we were still able to defeat the security force members.
Shortly after 9/11, an internal survey done by Entergy showed that only 19% of the guards believed that they could adequately defend the plant.
When you're hearing your security force coming to you telling you that they can't defend the plant, why didn't they listen to the security force members? Why didn't some of these complaints go into the NRC, get truly investigated, and why didn't they step in and do something immediately for the guards in reference to their hours, in reference to our training?
Foster took his story public in December 2002.
Right after 9/11, our nation went to a very different state of alert, one we'd never seen before. And one of the criticisms that opponents of nuclear energy had, and they certainly had guards who would tell them, was that guards were working overtime, that guards were not as well trained as they thought they had to be for what we were now looking at as a threat. When you think about it, what we did at nuclear plants then was go to a much heightened state of alert.
While Entergy has publicly claimed, and the NRC maintains, that security at nuclear power plants has been upgraded, are the plants really prepared to protect against a 9/11 style attack?
I think it is fair to say that we don't expect 19 terrorists. That is a very large number of people for al-Qaeda to bring together at a single location. You have to train. I don't know where in the Indian Point area you could get 19 people together to practice assault tactics in realistic conditions.
I believe that the force-on-force drill should assume large numbers of al-Qaeda to arrive, as they did on September 11th, that they are suicidal, that they are very heavily armed, that they're very technologically sophisticated, and that every power plant in America have the capacity to withstand that kind of attack. Thus far, that has not occurred.
If 19 people were to attack Indian Point or any other facility, would they win necessarily? I don't think so. That's 22 to 28 people at that site, armed to the teeth, in pre-prepared positions, fighting under a security plan that is tested. And that would provide significant deterrence against even a 19-person attacking force.
After raising concerns, Foster Zay was put on leave by Entergy. He no longer works at the plant.
If I've applied for jobs, people remember me as using the term whistleblower, which is, it's not easy. It's not easy what I've done.
Foster is under investigation by the NRC for allegedly revealing safeguards information in a magazine article and is currently contesting a claim of insurance fraud.
I've had things happen to me that I never thought would happen to me. My phones, I was being called constantly, threatened.
In my view, he's a true hero. He took a tremendous risk because he saw something. He could have kept his mouth shut and retained his position with the company and retained a good job. But he decided that the public interest should be put ahead of his own.
Well, I don't condone any threats that have been made on Mr. Zay, and we encourage people to come forward and talk to us, and guards do come forward and talk to us, and we do solve problems at facilities. And I think we have a track record of doing that in many cases. We have investigated security at Indian Point, and we found that those claims are, for the vast majority, not validated.
A guard who still works at the plant didn't want to be identified. He claimed that things hadn't gotten better. In fact, they had gotten worse.
Everything that Foster said is true, and he's one of the best trainers they ever had. We've talked to the resident NRC people there. The only thing they say is, well, if you don't have any concerns about the plant running, but, you know, in other words, they don't want to talk to you. It's all a show down there. It still is, and it's even more.
Whether talking about an accident or terrorism, it's important to keep in mind that not only could a major release happen at a plant, it already did. Chernobyl was the worst nuclear plant disaster in history.
In 1986, workers at the Chernobyl Unit 4 reactor in the Ukraine were conducting a safety test. During the course of that test of a safety system, things went horribly awry, and they actually caused a very large power increase that caused the water in the reactor that was being used to cool the reactor to turn to steam. And the steam explosion literally blew the building apart. There's now spots that are 100 miles away from Chernobyl that are uninhabitable today due to the radiation contamination. And it's so extensive that you really can't clean it up. You just have to isolate the area and wait for decades or centuries until people can get back in there.
Do you think a Chernobyl-like event could happen at a plant like Indian Point?
You couldn't have a Chernobyl-type event in our country. Chernobyl had no containments, we do. Chernobyl had a very different reactor operation, which caused it to get worse as it got into more trouble. We go the other way, we shut down as we get into more trouble. So you could never have a Chernobyl event here.
The issue with Chernobyl is that it's true that you would not have, if an accident at Indian Point would not unfold in the way that the Chernobyl accident happened. They are very different in terms of how these two facilities were designed, the Indian Point facility and the facility in the Ukraine. But that's not the issue. The issue is, could you have a major radiation release from Indian Point in the event of an accident, and could the effects of that release be every bit as bad or worse than Chernobyl? And the answer is absolutely, categorically yes.
Now, around Chernobyl, there was 1,000 miles, 1,000 square miles that were rendered uninhabitable, and 100 square miles that are rendered permanently uninhabitable.
In spent fuel pools, the radioisotope of concern is called cesium-137. If terrorists were able to interfere with the cooling of the spent fuel rods, for instance by applying an explosive charge to the bottom of the pool, and cause the coolant within the pools to be rapidly drained, you could have a situation where the metal cladding on the hottest spent fuel actually ignites, which would then start a self-sustaining zirconium fire that would then lead to a release of cesium-137. Then you'll have the release of a radioactive cloud similar to what we saw at Chernobyl.
Once the radioactivity gets into the air, it's going to go the way the winds carry it. The worst condition for Indian Point would be a cloudy day or a foggy day where the radiation is kept like a blanket close to the ground. So as the radioactive cloud moves downwind, it exposes a lot of people to a lot of radiation.
The plume blows over them, falls down, and they get a high dose of radiation.
Dr. Helen Caldicott has been a longtime critic of the nuclear industry and its potential impact on public health.
That induces what's called acute radiation sickness. And then the blood cells would die, which are made in the bone marrow, the platelets which cause blood clotting, the white blood cells which protect you against infection. So patients would die within 2 weeks of bloody diarrhea, nausea and vomiting, bleeding from every orifice, mouth, nose, vagina and anus, and dying of massive infection the way AIDS patients die.
You'd get probably a collapse of the world banking system. You'd get the destruction of the world financial center. Imagine a world without New York City. The terrorists already have.
Indian Point is a nuclear plant just miles from New York City, and terrorists could use it as a weapon of mass destruction.
This worst-case scenario, as Riverkeeper and others describe it, is an example of what could happen if there were a disaster of epic proportions at Indian Point.
Permanently erasing New York from the map.
But of course, it hasn't happened.
Could there be a core damage event at one of our facilities? Yes. Could there be a core damage event that leads to containment failure and public health consequences? Yes. But that's one of the problems with the stuff that Riverkeeper puts out. That commercial that they were running was just extraordinarily full of nonsense. The chance of there being significant doses in New York City is so small as to be incalculable.
Even if the chance, certainly heightened by terrorism, but even if that chance is still relatively low, the consequences are so enormous and so severe that how can you possibly justify something that's as calamitous and nightmarish as a nuclear accident?
The worst nuclear power plant accident in our country took place at Pennsylvania's 3 Mile Island in 1979, when a partial meltdown occurred at the plant's Unit 2 reactor. Afterwards, the NRC required all of our nuclear power plants to have emergency evacuation plans. FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, is responsible for assessing the effectiveness of those plans. In answer to our questions, FEMA filmed this response.
We come in, we evaluate the city, the county, and the state's planning, their evacuation procedures, all of their emergency operations procedures, to guarantee that there is reasonable assurance that the public can be protected in the event there is an accident at the plant. We did a lot of planning and exercising, and were able to determine that the evacuation plans and all the emergency planning outside the plant were very good. We were able to give reasonable assurance that those plans were adequate to protect the public.
The regulations now on the books limit the evacuation zone to a 10-mile radius around Indian Point. That's home to about 300,000 people.
Back in the 1970s, the NRC decided that 10 miles was as far out as they needed to go to designate an emergency planning zone. That was based on considering accidents much less severe than a large radiological release plus a containment failure. In actuality, people perhaps 100 miles away or even further could be exposed to radiation in excess of the amount that the Environmental Protection Agency says should be a trigger for you to evacuate.
About 20 million people live within a 50-mile radius of Indian Point, the highest population density surrounding any nuclear power plant in the nation. The plan in place does not include the evacuation of New York City. But according to critics, even the plan for the 10 miles around the plant is far from perfect.
The key assumption in the plan is that the catastrophe at Indian Point will be slow braking and that the county will have over 8 hours to evacuate the people.
Once it happens, everybody's going to know about it, and everybody within a 100-mile radius is likely going to flee the area. We actually conducted an independent poll by the Marist Institute for Public Opinion, and they conducted a poll with people within a 50-mile radius, and something like 60% of them said, yeah, if there's an accident at Indian Point, we're getting out of town.
Advocacy groups like Riverkeeper aren't the only critics of the plan. A number of officials directly responsible for carrying it out also have serious reservations.
Some of our town is within the 10-mile zone of Indian Point. I really think that in the event of a sudden event over at Indian Point, that people would just panic and we'd have mass confusion. Our roadways are not set up to handle the amount of traffic that people evacuating would have to use. The roadways would be overburdened. We'd have major gridlock at major intersections. You can see these roads that we're on right here. They're two-lane roads. This is a state road, Route 120. These roads are all blocked up on a normal day. And this is the main highway. That's as good as it gets.
For years, there had been a low grumbling in the community about the effectiveness of the evacuation plans. But it was the events of 9/11 that changed everything. In 2002, with public confidence in the plant's security flagging, New York's Governor Pataki commissioned an independent study. He hired consultant James Lee Witt, a former head of FEMA, to evaluate the plans.
The plans that we reviewed at the time that we were asked to look at these did not address a terrorist type event that potentially could be a fast-moving event. And I think it's important that whether it's a nuclear power plant, whether it's a chemical plant, whatever that potential target could be, that factor has to be part of our planning, our training, and all of the preparedness that we do and our exercising.
In his report, James Lee Witt, the former director of the Federal Emergency Management Agency, writes, quote, "It's our conclusion that the current radiological response system and capabilities are not adequate to protect the people from an unacceptable dose of radiation in the event of a release from Indian Point."
For many, this was the turning point. After the Witt report came out, the 4 surrounding counties refused to support the plans.
And then late this afternoon, word came down from Albany that the State Emergency Management Office notified federal regulators they cannot back the evacuation plan 100% because counties like Westchester have refused to sign off on it.
The ball is in FEMA's park. FEMA must, at this point, get involved, evaluate the plan, raise the standards, address the criticism in the Witt report, and if they won't do it or can't do it, that plant should be closed immediately.
According to word leaked from Washington, FEMA is going to recertify the emergency evacuation plans for the area around the Indian Point nuclear power plant. By doing so, FEMA in essence is saying the plan will protect residents in case of a terrorist...
FEMA still signed off on the plan, even though the surrounding counties and the state did not fully support it.
Regardless of the county officials' public stance regarding the plant itself, they continue to take very seriously the planning efforts, the training, and all the exercises that go on. Additionally, for over 20 years, FEMA has had a very close relationship with all 4 counties. We know what they do, when they do it, how they exercise, and we're an active partner with them. So again, regardless of their public position on the facility, they continue to exercise, train, and do all the things they need to do to be prepared to respond to an incident at the plant.
The NRC also signed off on the emergency plans, despite the Witt report's conclusions.
We read the Witt report. We thought that the fundamental point that he was making, that there were fast breaker events that challenged the existing assumptions in light of 9/11, that was wrong.
We're the front lines. We're the first responders. We're the ones that have to be out there. And we have to be safe, and my officers have to be safe to go out and do their job. And I don't know how the federal government can say that it is safe and it would work when the county is saying it wouldn't. I'm really confused.
We should be prepared for whatever type of event we may face. You know, that is an all-hazard plan. And if we're not, then shame on us. You know, we should do that. That's our responsibility. It's a responsibility to the communities and the people that live there. And, and not to do that would be irresponsible.
Indian Point provides about 2,000 megawatts of power. We do not need the power from Indian Point power plant. We have the power today to shut down Indian Point. At some point, it's going to become politically impossible to keep it open just because the risks are going to be so clear to the public.
Others argue that shutting down Indian Point would not be so simple and could impact the region's energy needs. Nonetheless, the threat of terrorism is something that we now live with every day. And as we know all too well, that threat is real, deadly, and can come with great consequence. I'm a New Yorker. This is my home. I'm not packing my bags and leaving because of Indian Point. But what I've learned isn't reassuring. There still isn't a no-fly zone over Indian Point. Members of the Guard Force feel unprepared to protect the plant and are afraid of speaking out. The evacuation plan has only limited support from the very communities it's designed to protect. What price are we really paying for those 2,000 megawatts of power? And given what we now know about Indian Point, is it worth the risk? Imagine the unimaginable. The cost is far too great.